Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And we're so thrilled to have you joining us today with our ASAP Policy Practice Group in conversation with Julian Reyes and Shefali Lakhina, and we will introduce them just a little bit more in just a minute. But if this is your first time here with ASAP, please know that this is a really welcoming and friendly group. And actually, normally, oftentimes we do more robust introductions in breakout rooms. But today, because we have so much content to cover, we want to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. So if you want to share where you're calling in from, and anything else that you'd like us to know about you, we're so happy that you're here with us. And because we know that we're going to have a little bit of a bigger group today, I just wanted to share a tiny bit about ASAP for folks in case this is your first meeting with us. ASAP, we are a professional association and social impact network for climate adaptation and resilience professionals. And we define that as anyone who uses future climate information in their day-to-day work. We have about 1,000 individuals and 45 organizations as part of our network, and they are really evenly split between the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors. And in all regions of the US and Canada, as well as the Caribbean and some other countries as well. And together with our members and partners, we are working to advance the field of adaptation by learning from Western science, Indigenous knowledge, and the lived experiences of people addressing climate impacts in their communities. And as I mentioned, we're really privileged to have 45 organizational members, an incredible group including federal agencies, cities, engineering and planning firms, and community-based organizations who provide invaluable support to our network and work with us to advance the field, as well as receive support from the network to advance their adaptation and resilience goals. Just a quick reminder to everyone to please go on mute if you're not speaking. And we have a set of 3 different program areas. All of our programs are designed to build the capacity of our members to do effective adaptation work on the ground. Network support and peer learning, that's what brings us here today. We also do technical assistance and capacity building and education and workforce development. We're really excited to be here with the Policy Practice Group today, which leads ASAP's efforts to advocate for transformational adaptation policy at all scales of government. And I want to acknowledge our Policy Practice Group leadership team. So if you're here from the leadership team, if you want to give a little wave in your Zoom box, that would be great. Oh, and here we are. Okay, I didn't update this slide. We've had a little bit of staff turnover, but our PBG leadership team is the same. And as with all of our Policy Practice Group meetings, we ground them in our policy priorities. And today we are going to be talking about the intersection of all of our policy priorities, but in particular, looking at a little bit more than the others at policy priority number 6, which is about establishing government-wide coordination and lasting authority to act on resilience priorities. All right, so before I move on, I just want to give 2 important announcements. So as most of you know, we meet monthly here at the Policy Practice Group. Next month, August tends to be a little bit of a slow month. We gather on the first Friday of the month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we are so excited to be welcoming Anne Shekani, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Transportation, to talk about the climate resilience work at DOT. So if August is a month that you are thinking of, starting your vacation early, or maybe skipping a month, make sure to join us if you can on August 4th with Deputy Assistant Secretary Anne Shekani from Department of Transportation. And then finally, ASAP Board of Directors voting is going to be opening very soon in the next 1 to 2 days. So I just want to encourage folks to keep an eye out for that announcement and make sure to vote in our Board of Directors election. We'll be voting in 3 new members of our Board of Directors. Okay, now with that, I am so pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julian Reyes, who is the Assistant Director for Climate Services at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and Deputy Director for Services at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. He's on loan from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he served as the National Coordinator for USDA's Climate Hubs program. Julian has a whole host of other accomplishments in his CV as well, and I'm going to put his full bio in the chat. But with that, I am going to turn it over to Julian and for his remarks.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for the introduction. And I know we're limited on time, and just confirming you all can hear me and see my screen.
Yep.
Great. Okay, I'm going to try to keep on time. Thanks again for this opportunity, Rachel, and everyone here. I recognize a lot of the names. The climate world is a very small space, apparently, even though we're all doing the really great work that needs to be done and more. So today I'm going to talk to you about a recently released report, a federal framework and action plan for climate services that my predecessor, Ben Presson, worked really hard on. And now in my current detail with OSTP and USGCRP, hoping to implement much of the action there and to really create durable and lasting authority and then enterprise on interagency coordination around climate services. So Executive Order 14008, specifically Section 211D, called for the expansion and improvement of the nation's climate information products for the public. In response to this directive, the federal government developed a report entitled Opportunities for Expanding and Improving Climate Information and Services for the Public, seen here on the left, and that articulated a vision and recommended actions for the future direction of federal climate services. Those recommendations are listed here, but central to that vision is the ambition to provide every American, every community, and every business with access to useful and usable climate services. To translate recommendations of the Section 211D report into federal actions, the National Science and Technology Council, or NSTC, established an Interagency Fast Track Action Committee, or FTAC, on climate services. And so what were the goals of the FTAC? Primarily was to develop this action plan for climate services that builds on the vision and principles outlined in response to Executive Order 14008 and really moves the federal government toward an operational framework. 4 key tasks for the FTAC were, first, to develop a common understanding on the scope of climate services across the federal government. Second, identify both opportunities and gaps associated with existing capabilities and governance. Third, develop a coherent and durable framework for coordinating federal climate services. And fourth, recommending key actions to advance the federal climate services enterprise. And not shown here, but I did want to mention the FTAC membership was actually quite diverse, involving many different government agencies, which also reflects the many activities and authorities on climate services across the federal family and the interagency. I also note we also held stakeholder listening sessions with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, universities, NGOs, and philanthropic organizations. Throughout the report, we understood that the federal government is currently balancing multiple opportunities and challenges, and this is the broader context of which we're embarking on this new interagency mechanism on climate services. We know there's unprecedented White House and agency commitments to climate action, a rich portfolio of existing climate services, which the FTAC report highlights many of them, historic federal investments in infrastructure resilience research and services, and also a rapidly evolving technology for engaging users, including expanded and enhanced decision support tools. Yet we also understand many challenges. We know that existing services are incommensurate with user demand. Services are difficult to find, navigate, and there may be a mismatch in specific contextual applications. And finally, that lack of coordination really contributes to gaps, inconsistencies, and duplication. So, in terms of a common understanding of climate services, the FTAC deliberated very long and hard and couldn't come up with a new definition. And so the report does rely on a definition from the 211D report, which is scientifically based usable information and products that enhance knowledge and understanding about the impacts of climate change on potential decisions and actions. More specifically, we view climate services as a translation, development, and delivery of data, information, and products that enhance knowledge and understanding about the impacts of climate change on potential decisions and actions. And what's unique about climate services when distinguished from climate science or research is that focus on the application, the translation, the user engagement, and really on how we're informing individuals, organizations, and communities to respond to and adapt to climate change. What I think the report does a really good job also of doing is recognizing that climate services are not simply the provision of climate data. They're often the products of a knowledge value chain, the sequences of steps involved in producing information products for a customer or end user, and that recognition of end users and decision makers and communities who help drive the dynamic feedback loops in this chain. And I'll highlight the three specific phases that I think are really important in climate services around development, delivery, and use. And where I think the federal government is really lacking, of course, is around evaluation of how we're doing and really driving those gray feedback loops in the chain. And so our overarching recommendation was to enhance the coordination and ambition across agencies. We understand that agencies are best positioned to understand the needs of their stakeholders and develop and deliver useful climate services, yet we need to enhance an interagency coordination mechanism and develop a shared whole of government strategy. And this elevates climate services from an ad hoc, opportunistic activity to one that's more deliberate, strategic, and a planned enterprise. And we know that this enhanced coordination will strive to meet the needs of the nation and also reduce burden upon users to discover relevant data and products. To achieve this, we're doing this through the U.S. Global Change Research Program that's consistent with the Global Change Research Act of 1990 and also the recent Decadal Strategic Plan. I won't read through all of this, but in addition to the overarching framework, we're also scaling up and scaling out. The federal government is scaling up by building a stronger institutional foundation of the governance of climate services through the U.S. Global Change Research Program, a more formalized approach to managing federal climate services. But second, the federal government can also scale out climate services by expanding the communities of users it serves and improving the services it provides. I won't read through all of this as well. I know we're running out of time, but I just want to highlight our recommendations around 4 themes: user engagement and partnerships, governance, common infrastructure, and capacity building. I do want to note the first theme focuses on enhancing engagement and partnership with both federal and non-federal producers and users of climate services, including through a potential climate services summit and enhancing public-private partnership. I'll also mention the last recommendation could also expand support for stakeholders in state, local, tribal territorial governments, as well as civic and boundary organizations. Finally, I do want to note that the FTAC report notes a major feature for the federal government's efforts to deliver climate services through the use of regional applied science and service organizations that work with stakeholders to build understanding around information needs and work to co-produce information that meets those needs. These could include NOAA's CAPRISA program, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers through DOI, and USDA's Climate Hubs. We understand that continued investment in regional organizations could enhance science translation that helps to bridge from federal data and capabilities to the implementation of solutions. And more importantly, this effort recognizes the importance of non-federal actors in the climate services space who have the critical links to federal agencies and who are also the trusted boundary organizations and partners. And we know you all play a critical role in both enhancing the dissemination of federal climate services, but also
went under the bed
between federal services and the needs of local decision makers and practitioners. And with that, I think I'm being called off. And so this is just a quick overview of this federal framework and action plan. Here's my email, and really happy to have a good discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julian. And we did put the link to the Federal Framework and Action Plan for Climate Services in the chat, so feel free to pull that up as a reference point while we continue the discussion. I'm so pleased to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Shefali Lakhina is the co-founder of Wonder Labs, a climate justice-focused social enterprise based in California. Just a quick reminder to please go on mute if you're not speaking. All right. And through the Reimagining 2025 Living with Fire Program's Design Challenge, Shefali currently leads Wonder Lab's efforts to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire impacts on marginalized populations in caring, equitable, and just ways. She also leads development of the annual State of Fire Tech Report updates to document areas of progress and remaining gaps in implementing science, technology, and innovation for safe and effective wildfire management. And I will put the rest of her bio in the chat, and really pleased to welcome Dr. Shefali Lakhina.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Julian, for the presentation. And thank you all for being here for this important conversation today. As Julian's presentation confirms, the quality and accessibility of our climate and disaster data will come to determine the quality and accessibility of the climate services that we deploy over the next years. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you all about recommendations for the launch of an open disaster data initiative that perhaps could productively tie in with the implementation of the Climate Services Action Plan. Next slide, please. So some quick background on how this idea came about. So a major focus of my work at Wonder Labs right now is trying to understand how science, data, and technology can enable safe and effective wildfire risk management. And in that context, I led the development of the first State of Fire Tech report last year to understand how fire tech, which broadly includes digital, mechanized, and material technologies, can better contribute to wildfire risk management. And here's what I found while developing this report. Digital technology represents the biggest area of innovation and investments right now, but we still don't have a complete picture of our nation's wildfire risk down to the granular level. And this is because the public, private, research, and nonprofit sectors are constantly creating more data, but it's mostly happening in silos. We're not linking these data in productive and efficient ways. And this isn't just about wildfire data. The problem affects all hazards data. And bridging this gap between the current state of our disaster data infrastructure and what we want to do with it is what led me to begin working with FAS and my two co-authors, Melanie Gall and Monica Sanders. We've spent the past months drafting science, data, and technology recommendations for the Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission, which is what we're here to share with you all today and get some feedback on what we could do with it next. Next slide, please. So here's a quick dive into three broad issues with disaster data today and why we need the Open Disaster Data Initiative. First, as I just mentioned, agency, research, and private data currently live on different platforms and in various formats across silos. And this makes it really difficult to accurately account for both immediate and cumulative damages. So what we really want to be able to work towards is for climate and disaster data to be fair, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as well as available for use in careful ways. And here I employ the acronym CARE as described by the Indigenous data governance principles of collective benefit with authority to control for responsible and ethical use. Also, disaster data can be collected in inconsistent ways and it could lack validation very often. And while we've really invested in layer of new technology over the past decades, we haven't necessarily invested in developing capabilities to use that technology in productive and meaningful ways. And to address most of these kinds of problems, we will need climate and disaster data to be validated according to national standards, which we do not have currently. And this is a gap that ASAP has, of course, also been working to address through Policy Priority 1 of your Policy Practice Working Group. Also, the problem with the current data is that most federal data is focused on the big events, but there's little and inconsistent rolling up of local data to represent the slow onset and low impact events, which happen with far greater frequency and represent cumulative damages. But these are simply not being counted in our national operating picture right now. Next slide, please. So as we all know, the problem runs deep, and it really affects everything we think we know about our nation's disaster risk and future projections. And we're pleased to share a plan to fix it. In terms of executive actions, we're recommending the administration launch an open disaster data initiative that mandates federal, state, local, tribal, territorial agencies to collect, share, validate, report on all kinds of disaster data in formats that are consistent and interoperable. We recommend this initiative sit at the highest level in the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is why it's so productive to have Julian engage with us today. We recommend that the OSTP develop a roadmap for rolling out this initiative, which we think will facilitate the participation of all relevant federal agencies in particular in creating the architecture for the nation's first open disaster data system. And we believe the OSTP should work with the Office of Management and Budget to create a well-resourced budget for this fairly ambitious initiative. We also recommend the OMB direct the National Council on Science and Technology to work with the National Institute for Standards and Technology, among others, to develop national disaster data standards. And we think that this will ensure that all relevant federal, state, local, tribal, territorial agencies, as well as universities, nonprofits, and the private sector are contributing to a common operating picture. Our final recommendation is to request FEMA, NOAA, USDA to coordinate a federated, open, interoperable disaster data system that seamlessly rolls up local data, including research, nonprofit, and private data, which is currently not the case. And we recommend that FEMA must also provide trainings to federal, state, and local agencies on how to collect disaster data in standard, validated, interoperable ways. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of congressional actions, because we don't want to just leave all of this work to the executive branch, we're also calling for congressional actions. We recommend the Government Accountability Office undertake an initial disaster data systems and infrastructure review, which will inform the development of the national standards, identify barriers for accurate disaster data collection and validation and accounting. It will help review lessons learned from precedents, including the Storm Events Database, CDC's Data Modernization Initiative, NOAA's NIDIS, and FEMA's National Risk Index most recently. And we think it'll also form the basis for the OMB and OSTP to designate an appropriate budget and capacity commitment to begin to implement this kind of initiative. We also recommend that dedicated funding be appropriated for the implementation of this initiative. And we also recommend congressional tools of technical corrections to support and enhance the initiative. I won't go into details, but you have text up there to give you a sense of what kinds of interventions we could make with those technical corrections. Next slide, please. A bit about the timelines, you get a sense of next steps. Right now, we're at what feels like a midpoint on this timeline, but it's really just the beginning of the process of consultations this year. And the idea is really to socialize the initiative with diverse stakeholders and think through some of the implementation modalities and entry points. And speaking to Julian's presentation, I see the launch of the Open Disaster Data Initiative is really the starting point for delivering better climate services. So I'd love to follow up with this presentation, have a conversation with Julian as well as all of you ASAP members on how we can get this off the ground using the Federal Climate Services Action Plan framework. Next slide, please. I'm also interested in getting your feedback on at least 3 areas listed here around relevance, implementation modalities, and expected outcomes. I also want to acknowledge the great work that's already been undertaken by ASAP members through your policy practice working group. You've created 6 policy priorities over the past years, and you're engaged in actively tracking progress on them. The Open Disaster Data Initiative, I think, directly relates to ASAP's priority 1, which is to establish national standards for climate data and require use of future climate information. It also relates to priority 6, as Rachel pointed out previously. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives and discovering how we can move these ideas forward.
Thank you so much, Shefali. All right. just organizing my screens here, and we're really excited. I was I had the pleasure of, helping to sort of plan this session and see how it would come together. And it was really wonderful just how um, complementary this content truly is, and how much these initiatives can build off of one another. And so as we move into our discussion, I would love to hear from each of you about how you're seeing the Open Disaster Data Initiative can contribute to the implementation of the Federal Climate Services Framework and Action Plans, and in what other ways you're seeing that these two efforts can complement one another.
I think I'll start. I think Shefali said it exactly right, is that the Open Disaster Data Initiative really can jumpstart this work on federal climate services and enhance interagency coordination. And so Shefali, yes, you'll see an email from me very soon. I really appreciate the presentation. And when I was looking on the website, what I really appreciate from the initiative is this enhanced data sharing and information coordination among multiple agencies and non-federal partners. And as you know, local data should inform federal disaster risk management and climate adaptation plans. And I really appreciated the nod to FEMA working with the risk management agency, since in my previous life as a postdoc, I worked with the RMA federal crop insurance data, and I understand the importance of such data in helping inform more proactive adaptation, but also resilience on the ground. Again, thinking about the durability of the work that we're doing. So just 2 quick points. I understand that we understand data are important in the development of flexible platforms for built-for-purpose portals and applications. So we understand why data are important for tools, decision support. So we get that. And I think I also want to make the point that while data are inputs into that climate services knowledge value chain, I don't want to forget that the feedback that we achieve through the knowledge value chain is through engagement with producers and stakeholders who help provide those data, or really help us understand the importance of those data so they are actually decision relevant and actionable. So I don't want us to forget that climate services is both about data, but also about the end users, right? And that the whole climate services value chain is ongoing, iterative, and a dynamic process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Julian. I'm so excited to take this forward under the flagship of the Federal Climate Services Plan. I think it sits right in there in terms of the starting point. And I think there's also something to consider when it comes to who are the data producers, the data owners, and the data users, and what are some of the ethics around that. And that is something that I, along with Melanie and Monica, should think a bit more about in terms of how we flesh out the Open Disaster Data Initiative. And yeah, I'd love to hear reactions from people as well from the group. I'm seeing a lot of similar issues coming up in the chat as well.
Yeah, definitely. We can go to audience questions. And Susie, you had a couple of questions in the chat about Susie, do you want to unmute and share maybe a summary of your questions for our speakers?
Sorry, yes, can do that. Thank you both for your presentations. One of the issues that I raised had to do with sort of the, thinking through the implications of making data available, particularly about risk and vulnerability. We're already seeing the exit of insurance companies out of high-risk areas, wholesale abandonment, and basically handing the liabilities over to the public. And one could easily induce a kind of flight of businesses out of high-risk areas. And that's typically, not always, but a high overlap with BIPOC communities and areas. So there are some real ethical and equity implications of doing that. And I guess the other piece, and that also relates to equity, has to do with how to design a data platform. And I guess I want to extend it, Julian, to the climate services, how to design access to climate information in a way that is actually truly equitable, and how to integrate both, what maybe the federal government might produce from the top down with bottom-up generated data. So there's a lot to think about. And the one group that I know that has been really hard at thinking through those kinds of complex issues is EDGI, the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. So I would highly recommend that you talk to them about that, because that might just leapfrog you through a bunch of complicated issues. So, and I guess the issue around making this flood of data available at some point, that to me said, is there maybe a possibility for complementary policies that would disallow sort of this wholesale abandonment of risky areas, So really thinking that through, what are the implications of not making the transparency of the risks all of a sudden a really bad problem for everybody who lives in those areas? So maybe you can comment, both of you comment on that part.
I'll go first.
Sure, yeah. Go ahead, Shefali.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Susie. I think extremely important points. And from our perspective, I think as we've been thinking about equity and data issues, centering local data, I think is really the starting point. The fact that there is so much local data just sitting, but not being used when it comes to our climate services, as Julian pointed out as well. But also like simulations, also thinking about which demographics need what kind of assistance. We're still relying on federally collected data, which is not always necessarily representative of local census block, especially when it comes to wildfires. We're just not seamlessly rolled that up yet. So I think that was really the motivating factor from an equity lens, that we would be able to address that if we had a federated kind of data system. So they're interconnected and they're talking to each other. It's not about all the data sitting in one system centralized, but it's about all these different kinds of data systems talking better and actually being interoperable. And for us to make sense of them, make meaning from this data, which is both at local level, but also aggregated sometimes to federal level. What is that common operating picture emerging like? We're missing data. I'd love to invite Melanie, who's also up here, to comment on that, because she's actually the data guru for me. Mel, could I have you on, please?
Hello, I'm sorry. Could you please remind me of that question? I heard it, but I, for a second, unplugged to do something else. So please remind me of that question. I apologize.
Susie was just commenting on equity issues and how we need to better consider that. And my response was that for us, it was, when we were writing it up, and for me, the impetus for even beginning thinking about this with FAS was really observing that when it comes to wildfire data, there are some kinds of data that are represented and that we are making statewide or federal decisions based off, but the local fire chiefs and the local nonprofits would be like, well, this is inaccurate for XYZ reasons in XYZ counties, and here's why. And so we need better federated systems that actually allow data from the local level to speak to seamlessly roll up to state as well as federal decision making. So I just wonder if you had any comments around local data, given
Yes.
that that's your business, you deal with data.
Yes, so I work extensively with NOAA storm events data set, and it's really hard downscaling these losses because of privacy issues. Like I've seen it in the chat, the mentioning of NFIP loss data and how you can't map it or how you can't or shouldn't share it. So how you disaggregate this data is difficult. It's challenging because the way it's collected, it's not really collected in a highly spatially resolved way. And to Susie's point about sort of equity and making risk sort of explicit, especially for people who live in this area, the risk right now already is implicit because they live it all the time. And I think right now, I think we are at a point where I think it's a level of reckoning, and it's, I think, also an ethical problem, is I feel personally we're playing a game of hot potato, in the sense of, you have, for instance, a property in a high-risk area, and then it's, sold to the next person. And then they inherently, take on that risk. And the question is, at what level at what point do we make these risks explicit, both to the people who live in these communities, want to, sell that property, want to buy a property. We have to really talk about this risk and then think about solutions, equitable solutions, because the risk is not going to go away. So we allow these people, communities allow people to develop in these high risk areas. And right now, people living in these high risk areas are the ones holding the risk. They are the ones who are faced with having to cope and recover from disasters. So there have to be policy solutions, to equitable policy solutions to help people cope with that risk in one way or another. And I see Susie unmuted herself, so I want to be quiet.
Well, can I respond quickly? I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I'm glad to hear all that, and I have absolutely no trouble with, the sort of the disclosure element here that we've just worked through in the mitigation side and are still working through. So I think there's an enormous benefit to that, and certainly to the integration aspects, both within the federal government and from the federal government and out into the rest of the world. I guess what I want to simply encourage is to think through both sides of it, right? Mm-hmm. It could backfire and hurt exactly the people you're trying to protect. And so just to think that through really carefully, and particularly hear a lot from the people who would be most affected by that, would be really important, which is why I'm thinking having some complementary policies that then address those, so that people are just not left hanging. Yeah, here's your risk. See ya. And then we're already seeing what people do in response to that, right? And so I guess, yeah, it's just a cautionary tale to, not assume that there are only benefits to data disclosure, particularly for the people we're trying most to protect.
Thanks so much for bringing this issue into our conversation. I think it intersects with so much of what we've seen in the chat. So we are going to move into a feedback portion of our program in just a second, but I do want to give Julian a chance to respond in this conversation as well before we do that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say kind of a slightly tangential question is the issue of how communities and decision makers are using authoritative data sets, whether those are federal or non-federal, and that also gets at this equity issue. And so I just want to note that we're not answering your question directly, Susie, but we're also thinking about, on the flip side, what are those data that are authoritative that are being used right now? And if the federal government isn't the producer, who is the producer, and how are those data sets vetted, and what is the quality control for those? And that obviously has really huge implications given investments by IRA, BIL, and these are investments that will be long-lived, right? So we're thinking about durability of our, climate resilience and our investments in infrastructure. So just noting that we're kind of taking that question from a different angle.
And if you would like to hear Julian speak more about this topic, Eliza will drop in the chat the link to register for our 2023 Private Sector Climate Service Providers Academy. So especially if you are from an engineering, planning, design, or architecture firm and you want to keep exploring that question of vetted, regionally relevant, publicly available climate data and information, and you want to hear more from Julian, register for that. Okay. So Julian and Shefali both came here today with a mission to actually get feedback on the framework and the efforts and initiatives and ideas that they've presented here today. And they knew that ASAP would be the place to do that. And we're really honored to host them and to provide that space for folks to share their feedback. And so we are going to move into a portion of our program that's really focused on you all sharing your ideas and feedback. And we've already started to do that a little bit. So I think we're in really great shape. So I am going to share in the chat. Oh, Eliza already shared, a link to the Jamboard. And so we're going to do this sort of feedback section in two ways simultaneously. One is people should really feel free to sort of unmute and share as we work through the questions. And if you're more of a writing person, please write on the Jamboard. And so with that in mind, I just want to walk through what the questions are, and feel free to move over to whatever part of the Jamboard you want to be on, regardless of what we're talking about here at the front of the room. And so here we are on our Jamboard. We want to know first and foremost about your work. What does your daily work look like? And how do the two efforts that Shefali and Julian presented on, as well as ASAP's policy priorities, fit into that? So kind of a general softball question to get you started. How are you contributing to climate services? And in particular, what are some cross-sector opportunities that you see for public-private collaboration on climate services, kind of fitting into Julian's framework, as well as the cross-sector collaboration that Shefali talked about as well for the Open Disaster Data Initiative? We want to know about federal and non-federal partnerships that are important for these types of efforts. What challenges are you experiencing for accessing and using climate and disaster data, and what could both federal and non-federal partners do to help overcome those challenges? If you have any just general reflections on the Federal Climate Services Plan, Julian definitely wants to hear about those. Other efforts or initiatives that haven't been yet brought up that you want to share about. Kind of big picture visioning around the Open Disaster Data Initiative. What kind of impact could you see this initiative happening? And then finally, any current data platforms that you know of that could support open data initiatives, particularly open disaster data initiatives, but potentially others as well. And for that last question, we actually have a spreadsheet where you can input that data that Eliza will share in the chat. But if you just have general ideas that you want to put on the Jamboard, that works as well. Okay, so let's start out with folks just sharing a little bit about what they're working on. We would love to hear how what Shefali and Julian shared about interacts and intersects with your daily work. If you want to connect that back to the policy priorities, that's wonderful as well. And how are you contributing to climate services, and what opportunities are you seeing in that space? Thanks, Emily. Go ahead.
Right. Sorry. So you might hear some background noise just because I'm sitting at a coffee shop while listening. But first, thank you both so much for your presentations. I have a thought about the current challenges to accessing disaster data. The biggest thing that I face is just being able to communicate and quickly identify the nuances between data sets. So for my position, I very often need to look at sea level rise projections. So Rutgers created sea level rise projections that are embedded in NOAA's data set, but it's not necessarily understandable, like unless you really go through and look at the metadata very quickly. So I've had some like interns go and use these data sets incorrectly before, which caused quite a few problems. So I think that's a challenge that I feel like a remedy to that I've seen is I've seen like story maps that go into with like visuals that show the differences between the data sets and like those nuances that people need to be aware of. So I think that might be something relevant here where there's disaster data, there's a ton of it, and just understanding that when to use each data set is really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. And Shefali and Julian, feel free to chime in with any responses as well as we wait for other folks to. Yeah, Paula Lee, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. So just to kind of add
on what was already mentioned. So I work in the Northeast, specifically in Massachusetts, and we've been fortunate to have a really robust program from the state leadership called MVP, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And one of the objectives of this program is to kind of provide consistent data across municipalities in the state, so that each of them are able to make decisions regarding investments in regional infrastructure. And we've sort of gone through that stage of recognizing that FEMA floodplain models are just giving us information based on the data that has historically been collected, but not necessarily forward looking. So the state has taken this on and sort of is putting out ways to create sort of more future projection, but also future forward-looking data sets that can make each municipality's response sort of coordinated, or at least have the same basis. And I just wanted to kind of talk to both the issues that were mentioned. I think I was really happy to hear Julian's presentation and understand better kind of what the federal picture looks like, and where it might be moving to. And also, Shefali, your presentation was pretty enlightening. I mean, we don't deal as much with fire risks in Massachusetts, but I completely understand that's something that with increasing time is going to be a much more wider applicable risk than what is currently existing. So given that in the New England area we are mostly looking at flooding as well as heat, and each municipality, I mean, as I mentioned, the flooding information is something that the state has taken on at a very statewide level, but since a lot of our decision making is very local, it's the Commonwealth, and we don't have that much in the form of regional governance, and that has been a bit of a well, for the lack of a better word, bit of a hurdle in trying to implement something that is, not one municipality at a time. So the last piece that I wanted to highlight is, we've been having a bit of a challenge navigating coming up with solutions for climate resilience from an infrastructure investment standpoint when you go from local to regional to state. And that is something that I'm not sure if it's just very specific to Massachusetts because of our way the governance structure works, but if either of you could talk about maybe another case or a better way of managing that kind of interface between different scales of developing opportunities for climate resilience scaling, that would be really helpful. Hopefully that made sense.
Thank you so much, Paula V. I really appreciate the depth that you were able to share about the challenges that you're experiencing, and I'm sure that you're not experiencing them alone. So really valuable to hear about all of that. With the few more minutes that we have for feedback, I would love to sort of move to a set of questions around partnership and collaboration opportunities. So we have this question around federal and non-federal partnerships important for open data and for building community and end user partnerships, as well as this question around additional efforts that could complement or enhance existing recommendations or existing initiatives that could be built upon. So let's move to just kind of comments around those themes, if we could, around partnerships, existing and leveraging existing initiatives and collaboration.
Rachel, just to kind of tie a bow on some of these discussion items to the last point, there is something called the New England Federal Partners, which is made up of 17 federal agencies. And that framework at the regional level is to support states, tribes, and communities in New England. So, I think, I welcome to make that connection to that group. And, what we're thinking about in the federal framework and action plan of climate services is to be a champion for these existing frameworks that exist on various scales that need to exist to actually reach the folks on the ground. And we understand it looks different across regions, since we know the risks are different, the needs of communities are different. And so, this may work for New England, but it may not work for the South Central, the Plains, for example. But this is just one example that, I can speak to for Massachusetts. But, I think part of my work too is to also uncover a lot of these great partnerships between federal and non-feds and really lift those up and see what works best for particular regions.
What a wonderful bridge to our next theme. Thanks, Julian.
Well, this is Claire Fogelsong in Bellingham, Washington. Since no one else is talking, I'll try to verbalize one of the notes I put on the Jamboard. We're trying to figure out what kind of metrics to use to answer questions about equity and justice issues. And the census tracts and what's available now don't touch on some of the work I'm doing, where I'm trying to service populations that are dispersed throughout our small community. So we don't have a census tract that represents that population. They're medically compromised. We're trying to service them to respond to extreme heat and wildfire smoke issues. It's hard for me to get my mind around how we qualify for grants under the current definitions of that are being used by the federal government and the state for disadvantaged communities or vulnerable populations. So I put in the chat, or I put in the Jamboard, we need metrics that deal with these kinds of health issues that are dispersed throughout the community.
Thanks for sharing that, Claire. And before we move into our wrap up, I just want to give Shefali and Julian a chance to kind of reflect back what they're hearing and maybe give just a final remark as we move into our closing. Shefali, you want to go first?
Thanks. Thank you all. This has been incredibly useful. I cannot take my eyes off the Jamboard. I am just kind of getting into it, and there is so much great feedback in there. So I plan to study it along with Mel and Monica. And, as we think about how we move this forward, we would love to have your continued engagement. Feel free to stay in touch. I'm putting my email ID in the chat now. And Julian, I look forward to connecting to get this off the ground. And thank you so much for your engagement. And Rachel and team, thank you for inviting us. Thank you so much for making this happen. I think this is such an important conversation. It is something that affects all of our work. Disaster data, climate services are important to absolutely everything that we do. So I really hope that we can take this forward in the best way possible. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Shefali, and also appreciate the ASAP team and Rachel and Eliza and everyone else. Really appreciate this opportunity to get feedback. And I thought the comments and the questions were really constructive. And I look forward to connecting, Shefali, but also, everyone here, feel free to email me. This is a dynamic set of processes that we're embarking upon, and we're really trying to build something durable, and that requires working with you all and really listening and learning from you all. So really look forward to additional comments, and if you would like a briefing about the work that we're doing, it is really all hands on deck to create this whole of government but also whole of society approach to climate services and really building climate resilience in all communities. So thank you again.
Wonderful. We're so honored to host you here today and really look forward to for everyone here to come back for future conversations, in particular on August 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time with Deputy Undersecretary Ann Shekani with the U.S. Department of Transportation. And another shout out I want to give to our program coordinator, Eliza Garcia, who did so much work behind the scenes, as well as Anna McGinn, who leads the leadership team for our policy practice group. And Anna, I want to just turn it over to you for our final words of closeout.
Mostly just thanks, everyone. This was a super engaging and interesting discussion and really fun to see all of the ideas and inputs popping up, both on the Jamboard, and then we made an auxiliary Jamboard in the agenda. So Shefali and Julian, make sure to check out whole pages of ideas that have been put in there as well. So thanks, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you all on August 4th. And if people have conversations they want to have following up on this or other policy topics that we didn't get to cover today during the usual kind of round robin policy updates, feel free to drop those in the ASAP Slack channel and we can continue the conversation there. So thanks and have a wonderful next couple weeks of summer.